In section, we'll be receiving an official series flyer. They were late this year. Normally they're attached to students' syllabi, so we'll be handing those out to you in section on Thursday. The second thing is, you will note in your syllabus, however, that the lecture for March 1st is in person theater. Have you noticed that? Have we reminded you of that before? I guess so. Person theater is that big building over there. Over there. Right? Is it over there? Okay. In order to be admitted to the lecture, you will need to have a ticket. And we will hand out tickets next Tuesday and Thursday. So make sure that you have a ticket, because otherwise you'll be turned away. We will be taking attendance, obviously, at the lecture as well. So make sure that you get a ticket. Do any of you, was anybody lucky enough to get a ticket to Hotel Rwanda? I understood it's sold out really quickly. I believe the movie is still playing at the Rialto in Santa Rosa. It's playing in Rohnert Park too? At the Mega, alternating with Hitch, right? You can buy a ticket to Hitch, and then when it's over you can sneak into Hotel Room. Do any of you have any questions or other announcements before I start my lecture today about the sociology of genocide?
Somebody forgot the jacket in my class on Thursday. I will bring it on Thursday.
As I sip my water, one more thing. I sent out to my sections a memo, an e-memo that was sent to me by the people who are in charge of taking care of Warren Auditorium, room that you're sitting in, and they've asked that you not bring food or drinks into Warren. Immediately, you're very quick. I noticed you put your stuff away. They don't want anybody to spill anything on the floor, etc. So if you could follow their admonition to not bring any food in, I would. Okay. I'm going to start today by acknowledging that there are visitors in the auditorium once again, people who have been very supportive of this lecture series, and also some people who you're going to get to see later on. I'd like to acknowledge them, the members of the Alliance who are here, and one of our speakers on the 4th of April, Lillian Judd. So thanks for coming. Genocide is perhaps the worst crime a government can commit against its citizens or the people it controls. Even though it is not a common occurrence, over 50 million people have died in genocidal acts since 1909, which is the date of the Armenian genocide. This has prompted some scholars to call the 20th century the century of genocide. I'll begin today's lecture by exploring origins of the legal definition of the term genocide, the legal definitions. I'll then discuss why and how scholars continue to refine their definitions of the term and the dimensions that they believe it corporates as they attempt to create an authoritative understanding and description of genocide and the complicated definitions and processes that are connected and related to it. The term genocide only came into common usage after World War II. At that time, it was necessary to have a legal term to describe the deliberate and systematic destruction of the European Jews. Now, in this class, we have learned that genocide has been practiced in its evolving forms throughout history and continues to this day. We are on the continent. You can see that there was genocide that occurred in the United States and more specifically in California. The Armenian genocide in 1915. The Ukrainians, people who were starved to death in a very calculated way by the Stalinist regime in Soviet Russia.
We signed to the Geneva Convention. So.
You give a perfect example. A lot of people are really uninformed about things like that. Did you ask them if they had ever heard of Abu Ghraib? Probably. Okay. You can't hear? Without a name. The enormity of the Holocaust, the task of establishing protocols for punishing the perpetrators, and the impetus to create deterrence led to the creation of legal definitions of genocide. So here you have this horrible crime that has been committed, but there are no laws against it. Perhaps you've read in your text so far that there was one person who was the inspiration for the creation of the term genocide. The term was created by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish scholar of international law who framed the legal concept of genocide in 1943. If you haven't already, it's described in your text that Lemkin was Jewish and he was born in 1901 in eastern Poland, the son of a Jewish father. In spite of this rural upbringing, his mother, herself an educated person, made sure that he received a broad education. And Lemkin received degrees from both Polish and German universities, and he also studied in France. As a legal scholar, Lemkin served in various capacities in the Polish Republic and practiced law privately until the start of World War II in 1939. In 1933, he traveled to Spain to a meeting of the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the United Nations. He had hoped to propose a ban on conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Social phenomenon, but you know that, you study in schools, and you know that there's no one definitive answer that you can hang your hat on when you study sociology. The differences occur because sociologists are attempting to construct generic analytic concepts which are different from specific laws or legal definitions. It's one matter to have to create a definition that is general enough to include as many cases as possible. Perhaps you'll understand a bit better after I restate Lemkin's original definition of the term, then give you the United Nations legal definition again, and finally I begin to present the definitions of genocide that have been created by some of the most prominent social scientists and scholars of genocide. So we have Lemkin's definition, very broad. Race, killing, the act of killing a race or group, excuse me, of people. It gets a little bit more complicated when we look at the United Nations legal definition. The paragraph at the top which says genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or excuse me, religious group. As I mentioned, this was passed in ratified and in force in 1951. Now let's consider some of the definitions from sociologists. Two of the most prominent sociologists who study the Holocaust are Frank Chalk and Kurt Jonasson, who are prominent Canadian scholars of genocide. And they give the following definition. Genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing. Who is the founder of the Institute on the Holocaust and Genocide in the generic sense, is the mass killing of substantial numbers of human beings when not in the course of military forces of an avowed enemy under conditions of the essential defenselessness and helplessness of the victims. So he throws in this qualifier that you see that is going in there about not being part of the war, engagement of any kind. Now, Helen Fine has written some very, very important things about genocide, and I would call her, without a doubt, the foremost sociologist of genocide. She's also quite an activist, which has me quite in awe of her. She's the executive director of the Institute for the Study of College. And she says that genocide is sustained, purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity directly or through the interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members. They're all different, but they're all the same, but they're all different in just slight. Now, Helen Fine points out that the UN definition is troubling, and I've read it to you a couple of times because of what Helen Fine has had to say. She points out that the UN definition is troubling because it excludes political, sexual, and other so perhaps that the United States did not sign this convention until the 80s, even though it was passed in early 1950s, is if you think about people who acted politically and eliminated a group of people because of politics, where might your mind go? To any war, but the refining of this is that as long as there were no non-combatants killed, it couldn't be genocide. Now remember the elements in here: the United States, politics, and genocide. Republicans? No. Let's go back a little farther. Yes?
Maybe the Red Scare with the destroying people's careers.
Yeah, but genocide is more than destroying careers. It's, Michelle? Native Americans. And they got reinforcement for that, political, from another member of the Security Council who was also actively involved in genocide. Does anybody know who that might be? The Soviet Union. Remember I said that there was a genocide in the Ukraine? Stalin, and to diet. She said she's even heard the term genocide applied to tuition increases in the contemporary press. Well, it's bad, but it's not that bad, right? What do you, I mean, when you hear genocide, I know students don't always have the time to stay up on things politically, but have you heard the term genocide applied in a place that, given what I've been talking about, might seem to you to be unusual or inappropriate?
By denying them the right to have their own culture and basically secluding them from other people.
It seems like we were trying to destroy them, though, or destroy their group or their ability to practice their culture.
We took all the stuff out. I mean, we just removed them from their homes and kept basically all of their homes.
So if we think about genocide as a series of acts, a continuum, how do you compare that to something like the Holocaust or Rwanda?
Well, I was thinking, with like what we did with interning the Japanese, it goes on the like part B of the definition, but I think it
Property, putting them within a group, excluding them, taking away everything they own, any chance of communicating with others. But the mass killing, I know torturing and things of that nature, but not to the degree that the Holocaust or what's seen in Rwanda. So I don't think genocide is the right word, but definitely something close to it. And that's where there's kind of a problem with lack of language.
People to experience that. So it would be like, it could have been a step towards it, like luckily people survive, but often only physically, not psychologically or materially. So those are things to watch, that it doesn't get worse. You know, something like that happens, it's already wrong.
What I had thought of in terms of the United States was, of course, the Native Americans. If any,
About how some people from Europe came over and were asking Indians to kill all their animals and use the fur for trading, and then they, depleted the resources and had no food. And then they were forced to use the stores to trade and get in there, and sometimes they couldn't. So just changing their whole way of life, I think, was a huge impact.
destroying the way of life.
Could you summarize that? I don't think we heard it down.
thousands of Native American were killed here.
I was also going to say for this definition under E, would it be considered forcibly transferring children when they would take the Indian children out of their tribes and just white families would take them for their own with no remorse?
Well, not just taking them for their own, but kind of
Well, yeah,
educating.
like changing them into how they want to be.
Yes,
I think a really good
way of life. Places.
Because all the elders, the oral histories of their tribes and various rituals, spiritual rituals for things. When they died, there was no one to remember the language or rituals. So nowadays, a lot of the rites that would usually take place in tribes, they have no idea how to perform certain dances and rituals and that's what we call.
So their ritual practices were also in. You are probably born in California, and I hope some of you have been outside of California. How many of you have ever heard the name Amherst? It's a school. Some of you might have friends or relatives back east. It's a college. It's named after Lord Jeffrey Amherst. I believe the school fight song says that Lord Jeffrey Amherst was a soldier of the king. Documents of taking blankets and infecting them with smallpox and giving them out to Indian tribes. In my way of thinking, from what I do know, that sounds to me like biological or chemical warfare, doesn't it? And yet it happened in the 17th century. So that was one of the reasons that the Americans who were at the convention were Ashis in Pakistan. Do we have any history majors? The second is genocide to terrorize real or potential enemies. And this requires large armies and investment in occupation. And the examples are the terror of Genghis Khan, Athens' murder of The native peoples of the Americas were reduced during the period of Spanish colonization in the south and by other European settlers in the north. And so a population had diminished to 3.2 million by 1750. I have to point out, because it's not on anybody's radar, certainly not the press, and the only people who know about it are people who are eager to understand genocide, that genocide continues that we follow every day. Can you think of an ideology that frames your own life? Land of the free, home of the brave. Is that an ideology that the most closely with what you've been studying? And you know a bit about anti-Semitism now that you've watched The Longest Hatred and read some of Bergen. In the case of the Holocaust, the perpetrators utilized anti-Semitism or an ideology to justify the elimination and murder of their victims. An ideology based on racial, religious, political, or economic justifications serves to legitimize any act, regardless how dreadful. You're probably just beginning to get some sense of how the Nazis used ideology to justify the things that they did. And the members of the subject group become vulnerable to attack. And using propaganda reduces the victim to the level of non-human. thus making it easier to annihilate them. And that's exactly what happened in the Holocaust. It's exactly what happened in Rwanda. It's exactly what's happening in a region of the Sudan as we stand here today. Now, Helen Fine, our friend, using theoretical ideas from that famous Frenchman, Émile Durkheim, and his theories, describes how important placing the victim outside the sanctified universe of moral nothing else. If you don't take this away today, I consider it one of the most important things that you'll learn in this course. What is the universe of obligation? Can you see it? The universe of moral obligation is toward whom obligations are owed. Who are you obliged to? To whom the rules apply. Who do you have to treat fairly? Who do you have to treat decently? And whose injuries call for attention and healing? People, and to attend to their needs and their suffering if necessary. So you might think just a bit about who is in that circle of moral obligation for you. Yes?
On the previous page, the things that were the victims and
It's not who you owe money to. It's not who you owe Christmas. Who is it that you owe moral obligations to?
yourself and your community.
Yourself? You have a moral obligation to yourself and your community. Can you tell me a little bit more
The
about
group
it?
of people with which you most identify and feel important.
Just hold on.
Myrna, are you suggesting that in a way propaganda can have an effect? I think this is part of Lori's question, about who we consider to be in that circle. That if we start hearing the propaganda about the poor are poor because they're not working hard enough, or people of particular religion are outside.
Leaving San Francisco. Yeah, and then they said it wasn't true, but they were trying to say that they all.
Is it all that? I mean, I'm sure we can all think of excuses why. But when push comes to shove, the decision about who is in that circle can be quite manipulating propaganda or ideology, and ideology shove them outside of the universe of obligation. The killing could take place. The technology of death has become more efficient as modern nation states have become more technologically sophisticated. While clubs, machetes, gun butts, primitive weapons like that have been places like Rwanda and Cambodia. One of the characteristics that marked the Holocaust was the Nazis' use of sophisticated modern technology. It was technology in the service of death. And when you read some of the more detailed things about the technology that was used and who created the technology, you begin to get very fearful about any technology. But we don't have to worry about that anymore, do we?
We don't have any drones.
I mean, if I say to you WMD, you know what I'm talking about, right? Car. Without thinking. I've seen someone who worked for the German railroad, the people who sent the cars filled with Jews east and that came back empty, say to a question about, well, what did you think that was required to carry out genocide in Germany and in the conquered territories? But just as technology has gotten more sophisticated, so too have organizational and logistical skills. Someone's tuning their jingle bells. Just as technology has become more sophisticated, I said, got distracted, so too have organizational and logistical skills. And sociologists, who are very interested in bureaucracies and their effect on all kinds of action, have demonstrated that modern premeditated genocide must first be recognized as organized state murder, and that it often requires a complex, first you say you don't belong, then you say you're not entitled to have the means to have subsistence. Then you say, and in fact, we're going to physically separate you. You have to go somewhere else. And fourth, you are subjected to erasure from the planet. It was an easier task to do this in some places than in others. But we know that the success of the Nazi entrapment depended on how isolated and disconnected the Jews were from the larger community. Helen Fine, in a book with a very accounting for genocide, found that the majority of Jews who evaded deportation, who were able to get away and not be deported to the death camps, lived in countries where the head of the dominant church in that country spoke out publicly against deportation before or as soon as it began. Denmark, Bulgaria. Now, additional areas of sociological study have included attempts to understand the action of perpetrators, the victims, obviously. We have an obligation to understand their experience first, but also rescuers, those people who were unwilling to shrink their universe of moral obligation. There's an excellent analysis of the social processes attendant to individual and group participation in mass murder during the Holocaust. That was done by Christopher Browning, where he wrote a book about ordinary men, sufficient genocidal behavior in them. How many of you have seen Milgram experiment? Zimbardo's prison experiment? Those were conditions that were supposed to reproduce what people in the Nazis supposedly subjected that killers were subjected to, that reproduced compliance with murder. So there were these conditions of peer pressure, social conditions, and one of the things he concludes is that years of anti-Semitic, being submitted to anti-Semitic ideology made what they had to do that much easier. Nobody, most overwhelming majority of people would think twice about murdering somebody, but if in your mind you could say, well, you know, I learned in school that these people, if we don't kill them, they're going to take everything away from us, is a way of justifying your behavior. Browning says, the collective behavior of Reserve Battalion 101 has deeply disturbing implication, other correct term for people who are sometimes referred to as gypsies. Political opponents, communists, and countless others. And as you know from your readings, the first victims of the Nazis were who? Someone speak up nicely. The disabled. They tried to avoid any kind of harming of people, but they wanted to get on with their daily lives. And during the war, the collective world's response, we'll read about what America's response to what was going on was. And we'll see that our whole nation was a nation of largely bystanders. Will change you and I hope make you a better person. Yes?
Can you call genocide on a micro level, how the Iran conflict of scandal, how our government was contacted with Iran and allowing them to import crackers to our ghettos, and in turn crack kill people overseas?
Deanna wanted to know whether I think on a micro level, something that you may not know about which occurred during the Iran conflict that we found out about, which was not society and says, sure, let's go and use racism just in its conception, if not in its practice. Genocide, small group of functionaries doing it. For me, it's when the power of the government is put behind the forces that do this. And I guess, yeah, I'm going to talk. But most people don't know that that happened. And the terror effects that it